A crowd gathers in tense silence. A man, naked except for a crown of thorns, is forced to wrestle a wild bull in a pit of mud, not for survival, but to prove he is worthy of ruling a kingdom. This isn't myth, it's history. Across ancient lands and medieval thrones, kings were not simply born, they were tested, humiliated, sometimes sacrificed, and the ritual that decided it all. It could be as bloody as it was bizarre. This is how power was chosen, not by birthright, but by spectacle. Before kings sat on thrones draped in silk and gold, they stood in circles of fire, bled on sacred stones, or proved themselves before crowds that believed the gods were watching. In many pre-modern societies, kingship was not simply passed from father to son. It had to be earned, proven, or divinely confirmed. In some cases, a man could only rule after surviving trials that tested not just strength or courage, but his favor with the unseen world. Across regions as distant as West Africa and Scandinavia, ritual kingship was the norm. Among the Ashanti, the golden stool descended from the heavens was said to embody the soul of the nation. Among the early Celts, the king's legitimacy was tied to the land itself. A failed harvest could lead to his removal, or even ritual death. And among the ancient Scythians, rulers reportedly drank the blood of slain enemies as part of royal rites, linking their authority directly to conquest and sacrifice. The use of ritual served multiple purposes. It wasn't just about tradition or belief, it was political control, public theater, and psychological manipulation all at once. In a time when literacy was rare and institutions fragile, power needed spectacle. The ritual wasn't a sideshow, it was the state. Bloodletting, dancing, fasting, or public ordeal weren't symbolic alone. They were confirmation. If the ritual succeeded, the gods had spoken. In Egypt, pharaohs claimed divine birth, often reinforcing it through coronation rites tied to the sun god, Ra, and the god of order, Mat. The act of ascending the throne wasn't merely political, it was cosmic. The Zulu nation held the Nkwala ceremony, where the king symbolically consumed the first fruits of the season, binding his physical body to the health of the kingdom. Failing to complete such rites could spark rebellion or be seen as a sign of divine disfavor. Why did so many cultures rely on ritual to install rulers? Fear was part of it, both the fear of unrest and the fear of the divine. In societies without police forces or legal systems as we know them, belief systems carried the weight of law. Rituals served as both a warning and a blessing. They created consensus, dramatized authority, and made rulership seem inevitable, preordained, or even holy. The line between religion, governance, and performance was thin. Kings were often priests, judges, and warriors in one. Their legitimacy came not just from inheritance or military victory, but from their perceived ability to connect with forces beyond the material world. A ritual, brutal or sacred, was the gateway to that authority. The chapter of ritual kingship is not about strange customs from far-off lands. It's about how human beings, throughout history, have built systems of power from belief, spectacle, and fear, and how those systems left marks we still recognize today. Around 1700 BCE, on the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization reached its height. At its center stood the sprawling palace complex of Nasus, a multi-storied labyrinth of courts, staircases, frescoes, and storerooms that once echoed with the footsteps of priest-kings, administrators, and artisans. But amid its grandeur, a singular ritual stands out in both archaeological evidence and mythic memory. The act of bull-leaping bot frescoes from Knossos depict human figures, both male and female, gripping the horns of a charging bull, launching themselves into somersaults over its back, then landing gracefully behind. These scenes are not isolated. Variants of this image appear in multiple locations across Crete, suggesting a ritual with widespread cultural significance. To the Minoans, the bull was more than an animal. It was a sacred symbol, possibly tied to the storm god or to fertility, and leaping over it, a violent, dangerous animal, was not entertainment. It was ceremony. The purpose of the bull-leaping ritual remains debated, but emerging interpretations tie it to initiation, status, and possibly kingship. Some scholars propose that the ritual was an entry point to adulthood or priestly roles. Others suggest a more political function, proving one's right to rule through a physical ordeal in full public view. In a society where divine favor was central to legitimacy, surviving or mastering the bull could have been seen as confirmation of that favor. There is no direct evidence that a king of Knossos was chosen by bull-leaping alone, but society did not separate religion from governance. The priest-king theory, now contested but still influential, portrays Minoan rulers as both spiritual and administrative figures. Their legitimacy may have been sustained not through inheritance alone, but through continual ritual performance. In this context, the bull-leaping ritual becomes more than spectacle. It becomes a test of courage, athleticism, favor with the gods, and the ability to perform under pressure. The athleticism involved was extraordinary. The bull in question was likely a large native species, fast, aggressive, and difficult to control. There is no evidence of safety precautions. The leaper would have approached the bull head-on, grabbed the horns mid-charge, used the momentum to flip over its back and land on their feet. One mistake could be fatal. In a culture without standing armies or codified law, this type of physical ordeal could have reinforced a leader's divine right through public demonstration of strength, coordination, and luck, all qualities associated with supernatural protection. Archaeology paints an incomplete picture. The palace of Knossos was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, and the Minoan script, known as Linear A, remains undeciphered. Still, the artistic record, combined with later Greek myths, including the Minotaur legend, hint at the centrality of the bull in Minoan ideology. Whether or not the bull leaper was a king, their performance shaped how power was seen, respected, and ritualized. What survives today is not a full history, but a set of clues. Frescoes frozen in plaster. A society where the line between athlete, priest, and ruler may have blurred. And a ritual that made danger public, not to entertain, but to sanctify. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, the kingdom of Gondor rose in the early 17th century as a center of imperial authority. Orthodox Christianity and deeply symbolic rites of passage. It was here, in the shadow of the Simeon Mountains and within the stone halls of castles built by emperors, that future rulers were tested in ways designed to strip them of pride, comfort, and even identity. Power was not inherited as a right. It was earned through pain, humiliation, and submission. Within Ethiopian imperial culture, particularly during the Solomonic dynasty, kingship carried not just political weight, but divine responsibility. The emperor, or Enkusku in Gest, meaning King of Kings, was believed to be a descendant of the biblical union between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. But lineage alone was not enough. Before any royal candidate could ascend, he had to survive what became known as the trials, a brutal series of rituals rooted in both ancient tradition and orthodox Christian theology. The future king was first isolated, removed from court life and public view. He was often held at remote monasteries or secluded compounds. Here, he would begin a prolonged period of fasting, often lasting weeks, meant to purge the body of worldly desires and mimic the trials of prophets. In some accounts, candidates were flogged by clergy or senior nobles. These beatings weren't punishment, they were symbolic scourges, representing divine judgment and a purification of pride. The one who would lead must first be broken. This ritualized suffering was more than tradition. It was a message to the people, the church, and the heavens that the future emperor had passed through death and returned, changed. The trials simulated a kind of symbolic resurrection. The candidate was stripped down to his bare self, humbled before God and country, then slowly rebuilt, physically weakened, spiritually sharpened. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church played a central role in legitimizing this transformation. Priests prayed, watched, and interpreted signs throughout the ordeal. The trials weren't just theological, they also served to test political resilience. A ruler who could not endure physical pain or spiritual isolation was seen as too weak to bear the burdens of the empire. In a land surrounded by rival kingdoms, internal rebellions, and shifting alliances, leadership required more than royal blood. It demanded proof. The symbolism behind this suffering was rooted in long-standing Ethiopian values. In both religious and cultural tradition, strength was shown not through dominance alone, but through endurance. The one who suffers and survives becomes sanctified, an idea echoed in the Christian belief in Christ's passion and mirrored in Ethiopian saints' lives. The trials of the king echoed those of the martyrs. Survival was seen as divine confirmation. By the time the future emperor emerged, bruised, famished, and silent, he was no longer simply a man of noble birth. He was a vessel that had been emptied, judged, and refilled. He had endured the fire that consumed pretenders and left only the chosen standing. In the kingdom of Gondor, kingship was not given, it was survived. In parts of pre-colonial West Africa and Southeast Asia, kingship was never meant to last forever. Rule was not a divine gift to be hoarded, but a temporary role granted by the gods, the spirits, or the ancestors until the land demanded its return. When crops failed, rains vanished, or disease spread unchecked, the king's body became suspect. If the world was out of balance, perhaps so was the man tasked with keeping it whole. And in some societies, there was only one solution: the sacred killing of the king. Among the Shilluk people of what is now South Sudan, the death of the king was not always a result of natural decline. Historical accounts recorded by early 20th century anthropologists describe a system in which the king, known as the Reth, could be ritually killed when his health faltered or when the kingdom suffered prolonged misfortune. His weakening was interpreted as a cosmic signal, his life force no longer strong enough to sustain the community. To allow him to remain was to risk deeper ruin. His death, by contrast, could restore the balance between the spiritual and natural world. In parts of West Africa, similar ideas appear in oral traditions and ethnographic records. The king's body was a living metaphor for the land. His vigor ensured rainfall, successful harvests, and political stability. When that vigor declined through age, disease, or omen, the sacred order required replacement. In Dahomey, for instance, a king's death was often followed by elaborate ceremonies intended not just to mourn but to renew the spiritual contract between ruler and realm. In some cases, these ceremonies included voluntary sacrifice of court members, reinforcing the cyclical view of death as necessary to societal continuity. Southeast Asia reveals its own echoes of this principle. In Java, the ancient concept of Wahyu, or divine radiance, granted legitimacy to rulers. But that radiance could be withdrawn. In certain traditions, when signs of imbalance emerge, natural disasters, famines, or signs in the stars, the idea of the king as a sacrificial figure emerged in symbolic form. Even when not physically killed, the ruler could be ritually dethroned or exiled, mirroring the logic that the land's well-being depended on the ruler's alignment with cosmic forces. These practices weren't barbaric expressions of political violence. They were grounded in religious systems where human life, power, and the environment were inseparable. Kingship was seen less as personal glory and more as stewardship over fragile cosmic balance. The king was a vessel temporarily, inhabited by power that was never truly his. Once the vessel cracked, it had to be emptied. Agricultural cycles reinforced this thinking. Societies dependent on seasonal rains and fertile soil developed cosmologies that viewed decay, death, and rebirth as parts of a natural process. The ruler's body became part of that same cycle. Just as old crops were burned to fertilize the next planting, so too could a life be ended to ensure the next generation of health and order. The sacred killing of kings was not driven by cruelty, but by continuity. In these systems, death was not failure. It was fulfillment and necessary return that allowed life to go on. The throne, like the land, could never remain still in early medieval Scandinavia. Kingship wasn't handed down by divine decree or smooth inheritance. It was declared, challenged, and at times taken by force. Norse society held no coronation in the Roman sense, no crown, no church ceremony. Instead, rule began with the acclaim of free men settled in open-air assemblies, called things often in full view of warriors, elders, and gods alike. The thing was the legal and political core of Norse life. It could decide disputes, ratify laws, and crucially confirm the right of a man to rule. A prospective king had to be declared by this assembly, usually composed of free landowning men. Without their consent, his rule was considered illegitimate. No matter his lineage, even the most powerful chieftain could be denied if the voices of the assembly did not rise in support. This acclamation was often followed by ritual oaths, taken before sacred objects such as the Hergera stone altar or the Ring of the Gods, believed to embody divine witness. These oaths were more than formality, they were binding spiritual contracts. To break them was to invite the wrath of the gods and bring shame upon one's bloodline. In some cases, blood was drawn and smeared onto weapons or symbols, sealing the pact between man, people, and deity. Combat also played a role. In certain regions, leadership was contested through holmgang, a formal duel often used to resolve personal disputes, but in rare cases, invoked during succession struggles. The victor could gain territory, followers, or even kingship itself. It wasn't simply a show of violence. It was a legitimized way of proving one's strength, courage, and claim in the eyes of both men and gods. Harald Fairhair, often cited as the first king of a unified Norway, stands at the crossroads of myth and documented history. According to later sagas compiled centuries after his death, Harald vowed never to cut his hair until he had united the fractured Norwegian petty kingdoms under his rule. He is said to have achieved this in the late 9th century, following years of war, alliance building, and strategic marriages. Once victorious, he reportedly had his hair ceremonially cut by a loyal ally, symbolizing the fulfillment of his vow and the start of his reign. But Harald's story, like many in Norse tradition, is tangled in legend. Archaeological and contemporary written evidence suggests that his control may have been limited and more regional than total. Still, the sagas reflect what mattered most to Norse memory, not succession by birthright, but by will, strength, and public recognition. At the heart of Norse kingship was reciprocity. A king ruled only as long as he protected the people, upheld the law, and honored the gods. When he failed through weakness, betrayal, or misfortune, he could be cast out or killed. Power was not fixed. It was conditional to be king. Among the Norse was not to be above the people. It was to stand before them, marked by oath, proven in battle, and bound by ritual to serve until death or dishonor broke the bond. Before the Christian crown and the Latin liturgy, kings in early England were made through rites steeped in pre-Christian belief ceremonies shaped by tribal consensus, ancestral custom, and sacred symbolism drawn from the natural world. In the centuries between Rome's withdrawal and the full Christianization of England, the making of a king was not yet a religious sacrament. It was a pagan ritual of transformation. In Anglo-Saxon England, kingship emerged not from divine right, but from collective recognition. The Witan, a council of nobles, clergy, and leading warriors, played a decisive role. They did not merely approve a succession, they conferred legitimacy. Without the Witan's support, a man's claim to the throne could be dismissed, even if he was the direct heir. Their backing was expressed not just through speech or oath, but through ritual, a public affirmation that bound the king to his people and to the sacred order that governed their world. Among the earliest rites was the symbolic burial of the king-to-be. In some traditions, the future ruler would be placed in a grave-like hollow or chamber, not to simulate death, but to represent descent into the earth, contact with ancestors, and rebirth as a sacred figure. This act drew from deep-rooted beliefs in the land as a living spirit, with the king as its human mediator. Emerging from the burial site marked the start of a new identity, both political and metaphysical. Other ceremonies involved the anointing of the body, not with holy oil, but with animal fat or blood. Sources and later Christian critiques suggest this was intended to imbue the king with the strength, vitality, and spirit of the animal. The pig, the ox, even the horse, creatures tied to fertility, war, and endurance, symbolized the qualities expected of a ruler. These anointings likely took place in open fields or sacred groves. Long before churches framed royal power in stone, the king's touch, often associated with Christian miracle-working monarchs in later centuries, may have had pagan origins as well. Long before it was claimed to heal scrofula under Christian belief, the laying on of hands by the king may have served as a ritualized blessing, a transfer of vitality, or a sign of the king's union with divine or ancestral forces. In early Anglo-Saxon contexts, the touch could mark allegiance, acceptance, or a binding oath, even as Christianity spread through England by the 7th and 8th centuries. Many of these older elements remained embedded in coronation practices. The Witan did not vanish. It adapted, continuing to meet at royal halls and open fields. The act of raising the king on a shield, a gesture drawn from earlier Germanic warrior culture, survived in legend and political memory. The coronation stone, possibly pre-Christian in origin, was still used as a foundation for royal anointing. when Edgar the Peaceful was crowned in 973 CE in a Christian rite at Bath. His ceremony was framed by liturgical Latin, yet layered beneath were echoes of older customs, ritual consensus, the bond with land, the transformation of man into ruler. What survived in Christian England were not just relics of paganism, they were its structure, repurposed. The ritual had changed in form, but the logic remained. The king was made, not simply born, and before the church blessed the crown, the people and the land had to speak first. On the Hill of Terror in County Meath, Ireland, a single standing stone rises from the earth, weathered, pale, and surrounded by centuries of legend. Known as the Lia Fail, or the Stone of Destiny, it was once believed to possess a power that no sword or crown could match. According to medieval Irish tradition, when the rightful king touched the stone, it would cry out a supernatural confirmation of his divine right to rule. The Lia Fail appears in some of the earliest Irish mythological cycles, including the Liber, Gabala, Erin, or Book of Invasions, a medieval text that blends myth, genealogy, and early Christian reinterpretation. It tells of the Tuatha De Danann, a semi-divine people said to have brought the stone to Ireland. It was one of 4 sacred treasures they carried, along with a sword, a spear, and a cauldron. The stone was planted at Tara, the ceremonial seat of the High Kings, where it would serve as both oracle and judge. The most enduring claim is that during a royal inauguration, the true king would place his feet upon the stone. If he was chosen by fate and fit to rule, the Lia Fail would let out a roar heard for miles. If he was an impostor, the stone remained silent, though no documented scream ever made its way into historical record. The stone's importance was very real. From the early Iron Age into the medieval period, Tara functioned as a powerful ritual site. While not always the seat of military rule, it carried enormous symbolic weight. Kings who claimed the High Kingship of Ireland were expected to be inaugurated at Tara, sometimes in elaborate public ceremonies involving chariots, sacred oaths, and symbolic marriages to the land itself, a practice known in early Irish texts as B'nais Higi, or the King's Wedding. In reality, the Lia Fae was probably never an oracle, but it served a crucial purpose. It was a fixed point of consensus, a place that anchored myth, tradition, and legitimacy in a culture where oral law, kinship networks, and ritual symbolism shaped political power, even as Christian practices gradually replaced pagan rites. The stone remained part of royal memory by the 12th century, when chroniclers like Gerald of Wales described Irish customs for Anglo-Norman readers. The stone had already become part relic, part metaphor, but it never lost its place in nationalist imagination. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Irish writers, revolutionaries, and folklorists revived its image as a symbol of lost sovereignty and ancient Irish identity. Whether it ever screamed or not, the Lia Fail spoke to something deeper, the need for visible, physical signs that power was more than ambition, that leadership had to be rooted in land, myth, and memory, in the fragmented territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Law and legitimacy often converged in rituals that claimed divine endorsement. One of the most dramatic was the trial by ordeal, a legal and religious performance designed not just to determine guilt, but to reveal the will of God. In the case of disputed leadership, especially among nobles or claimants to power, ordeal was not merely punishment. It was proof. By the 12th century, under the reign of Frederick I, known as Barbarossa, The empire was struggling to define the limits of imperial authority. Elected by princes, yet claiming divine favor, the emperor walked a narrow line between tradition, religious legitimacy, and political pragmatism. During this period, trials by ordeal, though rooted in older Germanic custom, became powerful tools in political disputes. The most infamous ordeals involved three methods: trial by fire, trial by water, and trial by combat. In trial by fire, the accused would walk a set distance, holding red-hot iron ore, pass their hand through flames. If their wounds healed cleanly within a prescribed number of days, it was taken as a sign of innocence or divine favor. In trial by water, often applied to the lower classes, the accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water. Floating was interpreted as rejection by the pure element. Sinking meant innocence, though often at the cost of life. Trial by combat was the most politically charged, especially among nobles. Victory in combat was framed as a judgment from God. In 1158, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa issued the Constitutio de Pace, an attempt to regulate law and order in imperial territories. While the decree emphasized codified law, it did not eliminate the ordeal. Instead, it coexisted with written legal procedures, a sign of the era's uncertain balance between reason and belief. Ordeals remained part of imperial court culture, particularly in contested elections or accusations of treason, where proof was elusive and political tensions ran high. According to 13th century chroniclers, Barbarossa himself was once challenged through a form of symbolic ordeal. Though not subjected to physical fire, his legitimacy as emperor was questioned during his prolonged conflict with Pope Alexander III and the rival imperial candidate supported by the papacy. At a critical moment, Barbarossa's supporters staged a dramatic public ritual, a trial of fire not in the literal sense, but in the form of a highly choreographed affirmation of his divine backing. He entered the cathedral in full imperial regalia as liturgical fires burned beside the altar, invoking the image of trial and purification. The message was clear. His right to rule had survived the flames of doubt. In this context, ordeal was theater. It offered resolution where law was murky and consensus fragile. It reassured subjects that power was not arbitrary but sanctioned from above. But it also served a political function to intimidate rivals, impress the masses, and fuse religious symbolism with imperial ideology. By the early 13th century, the Church began to distance itself from ordeal. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 prohibited clergy from participating, leading to its gradual decline. But for centuries, trial by ordeal had stood at the intersection of belief and authority, a ritual designed not just to find truth, but to make power visible. In medieval France, the path to kingship was paved with spectacle. By the 13th century, public ordeal had faded, but ritual display had only grown. The coronation of a French king was not a mere ceremony, it was a national theater, staged to affirm divine right, consolidate political power, and bind the ruler to sacred tradition. What had once been trial by blade or fire became trial by performance. The coronation took place in Reims Cathedral, a location heavy with symbolism. According to tradition, it was here that Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks, had been baptized by Saint Remigius in the 5th century. The site gave the ritual historical depth and spiritual authority. But the most sacred element of all was not the crown or the scepter. It was the scent ampule, the holy vial said to contain oil brought by a dove from heaven. This oil, stored in the abbey of Saint-Remy, was used to anoint the king, not as a political gesture, but as a divine confirmation. Without the oil, the coronation was considered incomplete. Before reaching Reims, the king-elect was often subjected to a series of symbolic humiliations. These processions of humility were designed to show that the king was not ascending by his own power, but by the grace of God. Dressed plainly, sometimes barefoot, he walked among the people, escorted by bishops and nobles. The goal was not humiliation for its own sake, but a dramatization of submission, a visual pledge that the monarch was both servant and sovereign. The oriflamme, a blood-red battle standard, once belonging to the Abbey of St. Denis, was another key symbol, originally carried into war. It was later paraded during coronations to link the new king with France's military and religious past. Though the standard no longer led armies into real battle, its presence signaled that the king was still a warrior in spirit, the protector of the realm. By the late medieval period, coronations became increasingly elaborate. Costumes, music, heralds, and oaths were choreographed to exact specifications. Nobles carried swords that no longer needed to be used. Rituals like the sevenfold investiture, in which the king received the crown, ring, scepter, rod, sword, robe, and spurs, were designed less for utility than for symbolism. The deeper the ritual, the more legitimate the power appeared. But the pageantry also masked a shift. Earlier centuries demanded physical tests, trials, duels, public challenges. By contrast, the French monarchy of the High and Late Middle Ages relied on image. Theatre replaced ordeal. Sacred oil replaced sacred combat. The people saw what they were meant to see, a king chosen not by bloodshed, but by sanctity. Behind the gold, however, politics remained volatile. Real power still depended on alliances, coin, and the loyalty of feudal lords. But for one day, inside Reims, under the soaring arches, as oil touched flesh and the organ played, the illusion of divine authority held. And in a world held together by belief, illusion was often enough. By the dawn of the 17th century, the monarch's body was no longer a site of risk. The ordeal, the duel, the public trial of strength, these vanished as Europe moved into the age of divine right and, later, constitutional monarchy. In their place remained only shadows, symbolic gestures, rehearsed oaths, and choreographed ceremony. The British monarchy preserved more of the ancient ritual structure than most. The coronation of a British monarch is still held in Westminster Abbey, following a liturgy largely based on the one used for King Edgar in 973 CE, yet over time, much of its substance was stripped of uncertainty. What once symbolized vulnerability, the anointing, the public oath, the royal procession, became part of a predictable script. No one watching expected failure, and no element of the ritual posed real danger. The most sacred moment of the British coronation remains the anointing with holy oil. Shielded from cameras and the public eye, this act symbolizes the monarch's transformation into a servant of the divine. It's a direct echo of biblical kings, Saul, David, Solomon, and an inheritance from a time when kings were seen as chosen by God, not by parliament or public opinion. Yet the ritual is now more about continuity than conviction. Few believe it bestows real authority. Its power lies in its ability to connect a modern figurehead to a long and mythologized past. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, monarchies across Europe systematically removed the more dangerous or unpredictable elements of their coronations. Combat rituals, public trials of loyalty, and even physical acclamation by the people were either eliminated or moved behind closed doors. The risk of embarrassment, political instability, or public disruption outweighed the need for theatrical authenticity. By the 20th century, monarchs were rarely crowned at all. Many European thrones became hereditary without ceremony, or relied on minimalist inaugurations. Even in Britain, coronations became infrequent. Queen Elizabeth II's ceremony in 1953 was a rare exception, rich in symbolism, watched by millions, yet entirely controlled. Every movement was rehearsed, every word measured. What was lost in this transition was the uncertainty, the idea that a king had to become king, not just inherit the title. In earlier centuries, the crown had to be earned through suffering, spectacle, or recognition by a volatile people. Modern monarchy is a birthright, not a trial. It promises stability but abandons the visceral drama that once made kingship feel alive. What remains is theatre, but one without risk. The fire is gone, only the crown remains.